Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us here at Reversing Labs with our takeaways from the latest Gartner report on software supply chain. My name is Richard Mellick. To my proverbial left is Sasha. Sasha, Chief Trust Officer, what is it you do? Say hello to the beautiful people.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at ReversingLabs, and I would say I participate in every kind of domain of our business that has something to do with trust that we convey either to our shareholders, our investors, our customers, the community that we operate in, our employees, or anywhere else where trust is kind of the currency that we're using, which I would argue, given what we do, is pretty much everything.
Yeah, it really is. Your impact here has been great. And this is you're my first webinar together, so I'm exceedingly excited because our backgrounds tend to cross over a little bit. So the conversation should be good. Today we are talking about Gartner's latest report, Mitigating Enterprise Software Supply Chain Security Risk, written by Dale Gardner, released on October 31st. If you have not received a copy of this report, don't worry. That will be in the follow-up email. You're going to be able to access it and read it and check out all their findings, Dale's findings, as well as supported through his research and his community there. Today's agenda, first off, we're going to talk about why software supply chain attacks are real and increasing both their data and our data, as well as other community-based data. So it's not just us saying it, it's not just them saying it, it's the overall perspective. We're going to talk about those limitations to the classic AppSec and TPRM tools and strategies. Sasha's going to be interjecting quite a bit from his experience in outside of the Chief Trust Officer space. He's not just a Chief Trust Officer by title. He earned it through his 25 some odd years. We were commenting if that's dog years or real years. 25 years of experience working with Fortune 500 organizations in the security space. Their critical need to identify malicious code within your software. We're going to definitely hit on that one, something we truly believe in. And we're going to drop some truth S-bombs. And then finally finish up with the importance of automated software analysis. That's right. Cyber years are like dog years. It's a 7-to-1 ratio. At that rate, I'm 102. Sasha, let's dive into this. This is one quote that just came out. By the way, everyone, these quotes are some of the best quotes I've seen from Gartner in a long time, because it really does challenge the classic perception of a specific industry. Software supply chain attacks have seen triple-digit increases, but few organizations have taken steps to evaluate the risks of these complex attacks. I want to put this into a grander perspective. A great report was released last year that showed over 700 million software customers have been impacted by software supply chain attacks. Now, Sasha, you and I have talked about, the producer side of software attacks. We've talked about the consumer side. Very rarely does anyone ever actually think about the victims, the users of the software, and how it's impacted them. But this goes to show, like, this is a ripple effect from producer to consumer all the way out.
Yeah, absolutely right. So let me just make a couple other comments that are just to kind of piggyback off of what you said. So, I spent about 20 years, 25 years, working between ExxonMobil and Salesforce, working for, the world's largest kind of consumers of technology and software and the world's largest producer of technology and software. And I will say that I have not, and I think you made this point earlier, I have not seen Gartner come out and make this emphatic of a statement about, an area in maybe never, or certainly not in a very, very long time. So I was personally kind of tickled pink when I saw, how their analysis came out in this and what they've said, because in many ways, it's what we've been saying here internally for a number of years. And I don't want to say that it's fallen on deaf ears, but, like often is the case, the industry kind of needs to catch up in some areas. And in this case, I think the numbers have simply been overwhelming. If you go back to not even all the way back, but let's just go back to like WannaCry and NotPetya. There we had what? We had Ukrainian commercial tax software called Medocs, that through WannaCry nuked, I don't know how many corporations are on the planet. You had giant logos who lost everything in 4 minutes. They lost everything. That's faster than an incident responder from the SOC can pick up the phone and notify the CISO or whatever, that companies lost everything. So if we start from there, approximately from there, and then we just start naming, CircleCI, Kaseya, SolarWinds, 3CX, MoveIt, these are all giant commercial packages that have all been parts of huge company and institutional software supply chains, and they've led to massive, massive impact. And so, these numbers to me, not only am I kind of not surprised, I would almost say they feel low given the broad impact of some of these giant, global events that we've seen.
I love that you went back to NotPetya, because I think that's something you and I connected on a lot, because that's, the little bit of my background and going up against the perpetrators of that, and you from your industry perspective, something you had to worry about. But that was truly one of the biggest attacks financially that impacted. I think it was Maersk that lost $8 billion due to that attack. $8 billion in revenue, shut down the shipping routes because they couldn't move their boats, they couldn't move their ships, and the impact of that, it continued to ripple. We don't think back that far. Most people go, "Oh, SolarWinds, that was a software supply chain tech." Yeah,
Right.
that was years ago.
No, it goes back a lot further. And if you
A lot
think
further.
about between WannaCry and NotPetya, the logos are absolutely Maersk, like you mentioned, one of the world's largest kind of shipping companies. And, when you think about what a company impacted like that means, that is also who the oil and gas and energy companies use to move their products for, wet cargo and marine. That is who, Amazon and others use to move product that's manufactured overseas to ports around the world. You had other giant logos. You had giant European grocers. You had FedEx. You had Merck Pharmaceuticals, right, who had to shut down both the OT and IT side of their operations for a number of weeks, and they carried over $500 million impairments on their SEC quarterly filing for I think like 5 quarters. So I mean, massive, massive impacts on huge logos.
Right. And it continues to go. The logos of impacted by software supply chain and their prospective customers continues to grow. It's not a slide that we've made because we don't want to name and shame in that sense, but it is something that is in the news quite a bit. Now, bringing this into that perspective, businesses are not ready. We did a report last year, a survey out to our through a group, interviewing a bunch of enterprises, and they came back with some really interesting data. 88% of them are admitting that software supply chain attacks present wide enterprise risks to them, and 90% have detected issues within their software supply chain in the last 12 months. Now, that could be through, post-deployment, they've released that software, and oh wait, that software is compromised. We got to pull it back. They weren't able to get a release because that release was compromised. Maybe there was a vulnerability that was exploited, taken advantage of. And then 74% are saying that their classic protection tools, now this is more focused on the SDLC side, on the TPRM side, but the SaaS, DaaS, and SCAs are not fully protecting them.
Yeah, Richard, just to make maybe a punchy comment on that, like
Do it. I love
you
it.
don't see, I think not a day goes by that those of us that are in this industry don't receive, 1 to 74 vendor or industry emails espousing some big problem that's a big issue somewhere that you should really care about. What you don't see every day is an issue that gets, a presidential executive order. So I think some problems and risks are created different than others, and some pose a different level of grave, widespread concern than others. I think one litmus test for that could be, when is the last time you saw, an executive order from the president on cross-site scripting? I'm not trying to minimize cross-site scripting. What I'm saying is that some problems present disproportionate risk to critical infrastructure, to the U.S. national security, to corporations than others. And it's not by accident that we have Executive Order 12048, that we have, the FDA issuing guidance on medical devices, that we have, in Europe, ECRA, the European Cyber Resilience Act, DORA, and many other legislative and regulatory kind of statutory pressures coming in this area specifically, because this is not like other risks.
It is not. The way that we've put this into a visual context in terms of software supply chain, when this is introducing the Trojan horse into your environment, you're leaving a gap. It's not just vulnerabilities. There's a lot more that comes into software supply chain attacks and a vulnerability. We typically go back, oh, it's a vulnerability that was exploited. No, there's more. there's secrets, there's tampering, there's malware that's embedded. Circles 3CX was a good example of malware that was embedded through a double or cascading software supply chain attack. And it was hidden by a Microsoft signature or Microsoft signed file. Like they are very, very advanced in this. And the lead into this quote very, very eloquently. Traditional application security testing tools do not typically attempt to detect malicious code. It is increasingly common for software, both open source and commercial. Commercial is that key point that you and I tend to focus in on, to be exploited by attackers as an attack vector. There was a question you asked last year, as you and I were discussing some things, and it has driven a lot of my conversations, and it was, how many attacks are in the news because of an open source exploit versus a commercial code exploit? And that has changed my perspective, even working in the industry. It's like, oh, wait, SolarWinds, CircleCI, not Petya. Those are not open source attacks. Those are commercial and proprietary code-based attacks. And right here, traditional application security testing tools are not catching it. You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not by accident that, I mentioned the attacks that I did, because what I'm trying to highlight for, our participants today and our audience, as well as in every opportunity I have at conferences and engaging with the industry and even policymakers, and I think the tide is starting to change. Best example that it's starting to change is in this report from Gartner. Is I think for years we've had this very erroneous kind of over fixation on open source as what people think of when they hear software supply chain. And I think a lot of that could be because, at one point we had, Heartbleed, which was at OpenSSL, right? Or Log4j. So there are clearly, I'm not trying to suggest, and I don't think you are either or anyone else, that there aren't issues in open source. Of course there are, but that is not what runs corporations, right? I did a talk at a large oil and gas American Petroleum Institute conference. I had about 400 CISOs in the room, and I said, hey, raise your hand if last time that you were doing an ERP replacement, you went with, an open source tool instead of Salesforce or, SAP. And of course, no hands went up. And I'm like, okay, well then raise your hands if you went with an open source tool for, order to cash, hire to retire, any other large corporate value chain software. Of course, no hands went up. Did any of you use open source instead of Zoom? Absolutely not. Are any of you using open source instead of, whatever, Microsoft Office or G Suite? Of course not, because corporations need commercial support. They need support, they need extensibility, upgrades, they need someone to call when something goes wrong. So while there's open source in commercial components, breaches are happening in commercial software. And it's fantastic to see Gartner highlight this. It's excellent that they have specifically called it out, because that is where the majority of the risk lies to corporations.
Right. And there's some comments coming in. I'm going to save them towards the end, but I think you and I, the audience is a little fired up here. So we're going to have some good conversation about this. So there is two sides to this coin, right? Where it's not just the software providers and the software consumers that are at risk. The software providers need to identify software supply chain issues before they release. And the consumers, the purchasers, need to find the hidden threats before deployment upon updates. Now, there's release management, application security, engineering, and product on the builder side. Those aren't necessarily as focused on the overall malware and other security components that is hidden in. And the software consumers, the TPRM teams, procurement teams, software architecture, and IT operations, they are focused on that, but their tools have been limited because, as you said, there was a hyperfixation for 15, 20 years on tools that covered the open source risks. Nothing really much more than that. There was a little bit here and there, but nothing as in depth as it needed to be. But there's this gap that sits in the middle, the gap that can provide that kind of coverage, where they're able to look at the code components and build and release before that final build exam has occurred, and then support the acquisition, deployment, maintenance, and monitoring on the consumer side. Because when you are on the provider or the consumer side of software, when you release or deploy out a software package, you are making a risk. You are impacting your customer's attack surface or your own enterprise's attack surface, whether you know it or not. And the driving force behind this conversation, behind what Gartner's report is that you, the provider and the consumer, need to have that visibility into the code into the software to understand that risk, to make a risk-based decision, to know what's being introduced. And then you can build out your response plans and be prepared, not for if, but when something does occur. And to bring this up onto your slide, though, this we've already hit on it a little bit. Enterprises run on commercial software, but big attacks are compromising commercial software. Is there anything else you want to add to this prior, following up your last conversation or your last comment on this one, Sasha?
I mean, the only thing I would add, if you blip back to the previous slide, because I think the graphic helps support, the comment I want to make is whether you are a, consumer of someone else's software, or whether you are a producer of software, whether that's for internal purposes or commercial purposes. And it's not like they're mutually exclusive. Even the world's largest software producers or providers are also consumers themselves. So a lot of people find themselves in both this consumer or COTS, commercial off the shelf mode, where you're consuming other people's commercial paid packages or components that you compile into your own applications for internal use or for your own commercial purposes. The point is, you want to know what is in that. Now, and I think this is to some of the questions that are in the chat around how do we think of SBOM and is it a part of software supply chain? I would say it's a component of software supply chain. How? What kind of component? Well, so an analogy that I like to use is, when I go to the grocery store, I like to be able to take any item off the shelf, turn it around, look at the ingredients list and say, okay, this contains these things. Here's some unique characteristics. I happen to be a celiac. I'm very sensitive to gluten. Therefore, I really want to know if the food I'm about to buy contains the types of ingredients that I don't want in my system. They either are incompatible, I don't want them, they're going to cause me harm, I'm going to have some kind of an allergic response, whatever it might be. Similarly, we must have the same capability for our IT systems. I need to be able to turn any product that I'm about to ingest into my IT system, I need to be able to turn it over and say, what's the ingredient list? What is in this thing? Give me the software bill of material. I need to know everything in it so I can make some decisions for whether the things that are listed here are incompatible with my system, are things I'm allergic to, are things I don't desire to have. Or if down the road, I find out retroactively that I've developed an allergy or there's something wrong, I need to be able to find everywhere in my environment that contains that ingredient. I think the same analogy applies. And so that's what, when we say SBOM is a component of software supply chain, we think it's a critical component of just knowing what is coming into your system or what you are producing in the software that you're using or either selling to others.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a great aspect to say it. And we're not saying that SBOM is all you need, right? There's a lot more to it to fill that gap. And that classic approach towards the providers and consumers, we hit on this a little before, but the layout, the technologies, the providers have SAS, SEA, Fuzz, DAST, IaaS. That's a classic SDLC tools. And then on the consumer side, there's the questionnaire, sandboxing, pen testing, other TPRM tools, a lot of manual process on that side, not so much on the automated process. But what Gartner is saying, there's a gap in the middle. There's a gap that is missing in the middle to provide that complete automated software analysis. Now, we will hit on a little bit more. We are very proud to say we are one of two organizations, not people, two organizations that have been mentioned and covered by Gartner that can deliver that in this use case. It is the ability to close the gap on third-party risk management and vendor risk management, as well as SDLC, and provide that visibility. Now, it's not just an SBOM. There's a lot more to it. We'll hit on it in a little bit, but that gap needs to be filled in order for you, the purchasers or the distributors, to understand what risk you're introducing in if you're going to get a bad ingredient. Now, bring it into the SBOM. There's a lot more to the SBOM than just looking at the open source code. There's a lot of SBOMs out there. There's a lot of SBOM tools. But these two quotes and one more that's a little bit later on are some of my favorite from this report. It actually got me excited because very rarely does Gartner come out with such a staunch position in terms of directing a customer as this. The inability or unwillingness of a vendor to provide an SBOM should be viewed as a significant risk or potentially disqualifying. That's a bold statement. And then to add on to that, an SBOM can be considered a container for information and potentially metadata about the code that has been included within the application, first, second, and third party code. So now what they're coming out and saying in this report, and what we do agree with, is that your SBOM shouldn't just be looking at one section, one aspect of the software. It should be giving you full visibility into the first, second, and third party code. And if a provider, so a supplier, is unwilling to pull back that curtain, pull back the sheets and reveal what's going on, you should be worried. I mean, Sasha, coming from your background, if you would have been told this 10 years ago and you started going to your vendors and going, hey, I want to see an SBOM, what would you have run into? And then how do you think that changes into the modern day perspective?
Well, I mean, this is all right, so we're probably going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because this is a big passion area for me, and where I think the industry is slowly, but is now coming around to some really important realizations. And I think it's going to be almost a tectonic shift in how we look at software, how we look at vendor capabilities, what matters, what doesn't. So, the inability, if I ask a vendor, I would like to see the ingredient list, send me an SBOM. If they won't do that, usually that falls into kind of one of three buckets. Either one, they cannot generate one. Believe it or not, that's more common than you would think, because the tools that are out there today, other than ReversingLabs, of course, can only handle open source. So when they say, let's produce an SBOM for this thing that you're buying from, whatever, insert your top 10 vendor here, it's very possible that they cannot produce one, because the tools that can generate it, open source and other free tools, are only able to handle open source components. And commercial software is comprised of, open source components, third-party commercial, third-party proprietary, all kinds of different pieces. And so they really may not be able to produce it. That could be scenario one. Scenario two is they can produce it, but they look at it internally first and they say, we're using a 23-year-old component with these giant vulnerabilities. We have a library that expired 17 years ago. And we have like 12 certificates that are no longer valid for over a decade. We can't tell our customers that. So then they kind of say they can't generate one because they're taking the time internally to, clean up shop and fix things up before they really show you the current state of things. That's kind of scenario two. Scenario three is they're uncomfortable showing you that the thing they charge you, $3, $4, $5, $6 million a year for is actually a bunch of stitched open source together. And, they're afraid that it's going to lead to kind of ACV compression or contract value compression. So those are kind of the three scenarios we've seen for why companies aren't generating SBOMs. But then even when they do, the other space that's interesting here, Richard, is, I've seen claims out there of, we provide the world's most comprehensive SBOM. I've seen that in many, many places. So, I've interacted with a number of, CTOs and other leaders from these companies that say, okay, maybe we have a different definition of comprehensive. Mine is everything with no excuses. Same here. So is ours. I said, okay, so if I give you this ISO, Windows 11, 9.5 gig ISO, can you give me an SBOM for that? That's a good example. So on that one, we can't do that because that's actually too big. We can't handle large file sizes. Well, what file size can you handle? Well, we can generate an SBOM for things that are less than 65 meg. Oh, okay. So comprehensive, as long as it's less than 65 meg.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Well, can I give you this, car area network, file, or this other file, or this binary, whatever? Oh, so that's another thing. That's another thing we can't do. So we can't do that because that's not one of the 7 file types we support. So we can't do that one either. Okay, so comprehensive, your definition is as long as it's less than 65 meg and one of these 7 file types. Yes. Okay. How about this one? Can I give you this, zoom.exe? Oh, boy, you're really good at picking these. So we can't do that either because that's commercial and we can only do open source. Okay, so comprehensive for you means as long as it's one of these 7 file types, less than 65 meg, and only open source. Yes, that represents exactly 0% of any enterprise app that I've ever seen at ExxonMobil or Salesforce, and I would bet any other Fortune 500 company. So there are severe limitations in what other tools in the market can do, limitations that luckily we don't have.
Right. And you know, you're hitting on something that even takes me back to the endpoint days where you used to be able to build malware that was over 500 megabytes and would bypass most scanners because the scanners weren't able to scan anything over 500 megabytes. And so malware providers would build a large package, a fake package, and do it. And same thing with the software. If your software isn't able to be detected and you're just accepting things at face value that, oh yeah, this is secure because it's provided by this person or because it's so big and nothing is ever that big, you're ultimately just running blind into that space. Yeah, dummy code approaching and encapsulation. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate that. Now, not all SBOMs are equal. Sasha definitely hit on it there. This is a generalization. I do not want you all to tear me apart about this, but this is a generalization. When we look at the traditional SBOM market as provided in, you know, hey, we're providing out this SBOM tool, majority of them are focused on two things: vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, and open source code. Now, that is only a small component of what is necessary to be looked at in terms of the full software package to provide that comprehensive viewpoint, because there are so many other risks and threats that exist within the space. And we hit on this. Sasha, you said this is going to be your favorite slide here. You need to be looking
Yeah.
for exposed secrets, tampering, components, proprietary code, commercial code, malware, signature validation, binary scanning. There's more features and capability that you, as the consumer or producer, need to demand from your SBOM provider. On top of that, the ability to scan very large file types and a lot of file types. Because if you're only focused on .exes or ISOs or the standard executables, you know, the 50 or so that we see, then there's a lot more that is missing because there's a lot more ability for files to be executed, components to be executed. Software packages are coming out with new extensions every single day, it seems. So that demanding of complete visibility to your provider or to your software provider or to your SDLC and application security tools is critical to stay ahead of the visibility gaps that exist when the software supply chain attacks. What would you like to say to this one, Sasha? I'm gonna turn it over to you and have some fun here.
Well, I think this goes back to maybe one of the first questions asked is, you know, do we see SBOM as a component of, you know, software supply chain security? I think yes. And where SBOM would fall in this kind of, you know, honeycomb thing would be, let's call it like the top right honeycomb, right? That might be the, what are the components in here in a comprehensive list. But what goes into software supply chain security in our view, and luckily now also in the view of Gartner, is does that code ship with malicious components, not just, you know, known vulnerabilities? Are there malicious components in it? Has it been tampered with? What embedded secrets are in? All the other things that you've mentioned, which is all the things that we do for a complex package or complex binary analysis, which, you know, Gartner now refers to as what do they call it? Complex or automated, continuous automated. Yeah.
Automated software.
So we were thrilled to see, you know, them kind of raise the bar on what we should expect from our vendors, because this is what we should expect from vendors. Of course, when we buy a commercial package, of course, we should expect that to not be shipped with malware. That is not a feature that was in our RFP.
Right. And the SBOM is just one component to this. Here's the other quote, my favorite one: demand transparency into the contents of commercial software. We actually want to make that the title of this webinar, but we were told we can't. But it is something that Sasha and I truly do believe in when it comes to you being able to make a risk-based decision on the deployment and release of software packages, being able to understand what's inside there on that commercial software. There are risks in the open source. Again, we're not going to dismiss that. The comment was made, GitHub is not bad for research and tools. Just check for code, check the code for hidden and encoded APT code. You're right, but that's a common practice you have to do. You are unable to do that necessarily with the standard tools on proprietary and commercial code. You can't do the same because the ability is lacking there. And I love that that was called out. GitHub is a great repository and great space to do that kind of research and find those tools, but you run a risk because it is open source. Anyone can embed anything and add to it. Now, to build upon this, it's not just the SBOM. The scope of testing should span both traditional checks for software vulnerabilities and the identification of malicious code. There are a limited number of vendors who can support automated analysis of code to detect malware. Now, in this report, multiple vendors are mentioned throughout the report of having capabilities to solve certain problems or others, but only 2 vendors are mentioned here, and we are one of them. And we're very excited to be mentioned here because it is the core bread and butter of what we do, of how we are able to drive the success towards software security. Now, I want to talk about that unique approach because why not? Our unique and complete approach takes the entire software package without requiring the source code, up to 4,800 files. Actually, it's over 4,800 file types as of the meeting I just had. Over 4,800 file types, up to 100 gigabytes. You can upload that. And through our complex automated software analysis, or as we call it, complex binary analysis, you will get a deconstruction. And that deconstruction insights will deliver the malware, tampering, secrets, mitigations, vulnerabilities, containers report, plus a complete SBOM. So it's not just that SBOM, that list of ingredients, but now you have the security perspective as well. What risks and threats are existing within that software package? And from there, the prioritization is critical there too. So if you are building software to release out to the market, and you want to make sure that you are not introducing undue risk, or you're making a risk-based decision, this is the way to do that. You upload the software package as part of your SDLC, you get the report back, you're able to make any adjustments, make any changes. This helps with compliance standards, as Sasha hit on earlier. Now there's executive orders coming down from the US president stating on this. We're going to start seeing more EU perspective. We're going to see some laws coming out of Singapore as well, and down into Australia. All these big governments are looking at the software-based attacks and saying, hey, we need to legislate against this to protect our residents, protect our businesses, protect our people. And so if you're able to gain that visibility, not just into the SBOM, not just into the open source code, but into the first, second, and third party code completely, and understand all the threats and risks in therein, you are able to make that risk-based decision. Now, on the acquisition side, if you are acquiring software and you want to make sure that, hey, that survey that you did through the vast application process, is that backed up by data, a repeatable process? You don't have to upload things into a sandbox and execute it, wait for it to execute, hope it executes, doesn't exit the escape the sandbox. You're able to do this at a completely repeatable process. Each version, hey, you're getting a brand new version, a brand new update, you're able to go through this process. What risks are going to be introduced? I want to take that back to the story of 3CX. Now, 3CX, if you're not familiar with it, it's a VoIP-based software and it lives on the desktop. And through a double software supply chain attack, or another way to say is cascading software supply chain attack, malware was embedded within their code, within an update. So it wasn't brand new software that people were downloading and then getting infected. It was an update that 3CX pushed out to their customer base that had malware embedded in it. Now, if you're not aware of who put that malware in there, it was the Lazarus Group out of North Korea. They've been in hiding for 4 years prior to this. But all of a sudden, they're using software supply chain attacks to deliver malware, and they're successful at it. Now, another key point of that malware was not net new. It was a new variant of an existing piece of malware that most endpoint security products had already seen. But if they had done the check at that with our complex binary analysis, they would have seen the discrepancy. They would have seen the malware hiding behind the signature. They would have been able to address it before releasing it and impacting over 60,000 of their own customers and suffering an impact to their brand. Sasha, anything you want to add to this? Because I know this is this technology is what brought you to us. This is what attracted you to ReversingLabs.
Yeah, I mean, look, what I would tell you is this is what ReversingLabs has been doing for now almost 14 years, right? When the company was first created in, I think, late 08 or early 09, something along those lines, they set out to be the best at finding bad things in as many places, packages, files as possible. And they wanted to do that at near line speed with no excuses. So they said, Well, what if a file is big? We have to support it. Well, what if it's, one of these obscure custom packers or compilers or proprietary ones? We have to support it. Well, what if it's, this obscure file extension? We have to support it. And what has been built over the last 14 years is an engine that does exactly that, but it was originally purpose-built for malware. And as a result, ReversingLabs also has the world's largest malware repository, which is 7 times bigger than that of VirusTotal or Google.
It's 8 times as of the beginning of this year. We are now 8 times the size.
I believe that because not only is the total bigger, the daily submissions is also 3.5 times more than VirusTotal, which means the gap is big and getting bigger. So now that number is 8 times bigger, and I suspect that to get even bigger. So that kind of lineage of the company and that engine that has been built over 14 years, fast forward to when we said, boy, executive order this, and what happened at SolarWinds and other places, what do we need now to recursively, unpack and analyze the most complex packages? Well, it turns out you need exactly the engine that has been built for 14 years, but presented with a different set of outputs and a different persona, because it's not necessarily a malware analyst or a SOC engineer. It's maybe more of a product security person or someone in third-party risk management or someone in procurement or someone in, product engineering or product security or AppSec teams or software security groups or places like that. So, what I want to highlight is this is not a capability that was built overnight. This has been built through unbelievably hard work by hundreds of engineers over 14 years to have the differentiated capability that we have today.
Right. I appreciate that. Now, Sasha, it is one thing, we've been hitting on the ingredient side. We've been hitting on SBOMs with limited visibility, some of the SDLC tools with limited visibility. It's one thing to understand, you take this back to your celiac, you understand this one ingredient may make you sick, but this one ingredient with that one is going to make you even more sick. The only way you're going to know that is if you see how it interacts. This is the analogy that I think it was day one, you came in and you said, this is the big overall story that we need to move towards. And that Gartner said with a lot, 14 pages, but we're saying with 1 sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I like this analogy is, a typical car manufacturer or car has something like 128 to 140 suppliers. And specifically beyond hardware has about 128 to 140 software suppliers. But back to, the car's kind of hardware bits. There's a reason why they don't crash test the radio volume knob separate from the windshield wiper, separate from the seat, separate from the, headliner. It's because while those things are important to unit test and test from their own merits and tolerances and whatever, there's only one way to know how the system as a whole will perform, which is to test it at the end when the system as a whole has been put together, compiled, packaged, produced, and then they crash test it. It's also the reason why, for example, if you want Apple's MFi or any other certification, you can't submit, an early prototype model. They want the paint to be on the product. They want every sticker to be on it, because maybe when it heats up, that sticker that you're going to put at the end will interact with the product in a way that's undesirable. Same thing. Cars are tested at the end when the entire thing is the final product. So I think that the discussion we need to have on this slide is, look, I used to, the reason I'm gray here is because I lost a lot of sleep being in charge of, the AppSec program at 2 of the world's largest companies, Fortune 1 and Fortune 35 or whatever it is. The challenge there was always, how do I, and in one case I had almost 8,000 commercial pieces of software that were someone else's, meaning not my SDLC. So at that time, the AppSec program, for 15 years, we were saying shift left and move left. And that is still absolutely true. We still want to shift left. We want to catch things earlier. We want to analyze the smallest components in the earliest possible phase when we can. There's even some studies that say if you catch something at design versus production, it could be 140 times less expensive to fix. Those are all great merits, and that still continues to be true. However, when you shift left, you gain component view, but you lose context. When you shift right, you lose componentry, right? You lose unit insights and becomes more complicated, complex, larger, but you gain context. And so what we're saying is it's not at the detriment or instead of the stuff that was shifting left, but you can't SAST someone else's compiled binary. You can't DAST someone else's compiled binary. And so a lot of the investments that we've all made over the past 15 years, unfortunately, do almost nothing to help us with software supply chain risk. And so what we're positioning is, and what Gartner has also said, is that applications need this sort of analogously, this crash test at the end. When the entire thing is built, when first party, second party, third party code, or even contracted first party code, right? It's still your app, but it's produced for you by a third party somewhere overseas. When all those bits are added together, including all the imports and includes, which may include open source components and third party proprietary and commercial components, when that whole thing is put together as a binary or a tarball or an AI model, Docker image, or whatever it might be, that's the time to take another look at it to see how the system as a whole will perform, which is why the analogy we use here is, the car crash test, because there's a reason they do that at the end, to see how the system as a whole will perform.
Yeah, and the car crash test is the greatest way it's one of the best analogies I've seen when it comes to testing complete software packages, because ultimately it is it is throwing everything into the gauntlet, and it's not until you see things happen in real life that you're able to react. And there's a lot of conversation that we've had it at conferences, we've had it at in one-on-one conversations with people, and they say, well, I'm going to just release the software and my endpoint security product will catch it if it's a risk. Now, that's more of my background in terms of that space. That's a lot of money, a lot of investment to clean up. There's a lot of work. The mitigation costs alone are going to exceed the costs of testing the software prior to release. And if that ripple effect continues through your company, what data is lost, you've got potential legal ramifications and more. Versus if you just look at the crash test data and say, okay, wait a second, is this software worth purchasing, worth us taking that risk? We need to make a risk-based decision on our attack surface, or on the producer side, we need to make a risk-based decision on our brand. Because the ramifications of a software supply chain attack are not just immediate and they dissipate. We're seeing it in the likes of SolarWinds. 3 years later, the US government has charged members of the C-suite of SolarWinds because of their negligence prior to the attack. Now, I do want to make one caveat. We've called out 3CX and SolarWinds a few times in this one. Following their software supply chain attacks, both organizations have now become ReversingLabs customers to address their software development lifecycle, software supply chain security, and we are fully implemented into both organizations to support them. There are demos that we do, you can find it on our YouTube, that kind of go over, especially the 3CX side, what happens when you do the risk-based decisions, and you can see the improvement in the releases every single time from that initial release with the malware embedded up into the modern release, because they have implemented proper crash testing of their software packages before deploying out to their customers. Ultimately, what Gartner is saying, what we are saying, is future attacks will take advantage of visibility gaps. Whether you are a software producer or a software consumer, if you do not see inside the software, if you are not demanding the transparency of the software you're purchasing, or if you are not providing the transparency of the software you're producing, there's going to be gaps that are going to be introduced. And the attackers, the threat actors out there, they're going to continue to take advantage of this. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not script kiddies in basements that are taking advantage of your software supply chain attacks. These are multinational, well-funded organizations. SolarWinds, that was perpetuated by a Russian-backed organization. 3CX was perpetuated by a North Korean-backed organization. Trickle-down theory applies here. When they take advantage of it, they prove it's a proof of concept. We start to see it spread out to the smaller threat actors. And more proof of concepts continue to show up. And so this attack surface, this attack vector against your enterprise, against your brand, is going to increase. And without that transparency, without that visibility, you're going to be left blind until it happens. Any final notes you want to add here, Sasha?
Well, I would just say that, what happened at SolarWinds is probably, for those who are attending this, who are CISOs or one day want to be one, or, are about to be one, or that's their path. I think of what happened there as kind of the Enron moment for the cyber industry. Um, there is kind of BC and AD. There's everything that CISOs did and what it meant and what level of accountability and liability they had before. And then there's everything after the Wells notice, and how they're now thinking about their personal liability. I personally know 3, actually maybe even 4 Fortune 50 CISOs who have in the last month and a half quit. You can find their, new gig announcements on LinkedIn. You'll prominently know who they are, who used to be frontline CSOs or CISOs at giant foreign Fortune 50 companies, who have deliberately left that post because in the post kind of SolarWinds CISO world, they now feel uncomfortable with the level of personal liability that's out there for them. There's many, many areas where that applies. One of them is in software supply chain, which is how much personal accountability and liability will you have for the risk that someone else's SDLC introduced into your environment? And what will a court of law and a jury of peers, keep in mind, a jury made up of plumbers, electricians, teachers, nurses, and bus drivers, what will they think about negligence, which is what, the Equifax case was very famous for. What did they think about an unpacked SQL box for 90 days? They thought it was egregious. For most CISOs, that's just a Wednesday for a number of reasons. So up until now, when it comes to software supply chain, you've mostly had the vendor's word, some amount of trust or built up credibility, and then maybe some contractual language that, let's face it, if you actually lose your company, like, Merck did in 4 minutes, won't do much for you. So CISOs are now starting to ask much harder questions because their personal financial liability, fiduciary responsibility, and maybe going to jail depends on it, which is, what are you shipping? And they're expecting higher standards and expectations from their supply chain than they have in the past. We also actually just this morning found out that one of our customers, a very, very large bank, is basically developing a watch list. They're developing a watch list of products that they will not renew unless the product security and the characteristics of that product change in meaningful ways, actually the ways that we've just described around malware, non-tampering, and that those become verifiable attestations. They will put the vendors on a non-renew list in the future. I think that is the kind of behavior you're going to see more and more of here coming up.
Yeah, and the no-fly list is an absolute wonderful example of what happens when organizations do not feel protected by the companies that they're buying from, and they need to protect themselves. And that's what we're here to help you all walk away with, is the ability to to look into this, the ability to make that protection. Because if you're not getting it from your vendor, if you're not getting it from the provider aspect, we are able to provide that visibility in there. Great final question. I love this one. There should be NIST guidance on vendor software management, right? Yes, I would say so. I'm not as involved on the NIST side as I wish I was, but Sasha, what's your thoughts on NIST guidance for vendor software management?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a favorite alphabet soup here, whether it's NIST or whoever, I don't care which one it is. I would just say that, if you look at what we've had up until now, which is, ISO 27K2 with some specific subsections for that. And you have some NIST 800 dash whatever it is, and you have some other stuff, but all of it has been kind of very light and probably for some good reasons, historically non-prescriptive, but that has not worked. And so I think what you now see is CISA, NIST, and others inching closer and closer towards more prescriptive guidance for software providers or producers. You also see a number of companies working on things like open letter initiatives on behalf of CISOs to the vendor community to say, look, as buyers, these are our new expectations. But I'll leave you with one very interesting one, which is, maybe the vendor community, if the buyer community started actually in concert acting a certain way and not buying, maybe that would lead to some change. But up until now, we haven't seen that, because unfortunately, in many of these cases, if you're on, not to single anyone out, but let's say if you're on one very large monolithic ERP platform, your your switching cost is so exorbitant, right? And the practical change management is so ridiculously complex that the reality is, of course, you will renew with them, and of course, you will use them forever. Getting out of that, I've heard someone, in the past who I used to work with describe relationship with those kinds of companies as a terrible marriage with too high of a cost of divorce. So will it hit their pockets? Maybe, if all the buyers started acting kind of in concert or in unison again, in favor of some of these higher standards. But more practically, what is starting to happen, because it does have direct impact on their bottom line, is the cyber insurance industry. So what they are starting to do is to say, look, why are we having payouts? We're having payouts because of breaches. Why are breaches happening? Unsurprisingly, they're happening because of the exact same facts that we've laid out for you here, and disproportionately due to software supply chain reasons. So now the cyber insurers and their underwriters and brokers are starting to incorporate facets of software supply chain analysis and what do you do to scrutinize the software that you consume and produce, specifically in these types of ways that we've described, as things impacting your premiums and renewals. So many, many years ago, in fact, I was at the very first Black Hat cyber insurance kind of inaugural breakfast, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And it was like 4 of us from the practitioner side, from cyber. And then we invited a bunch of insurance people. And frankly, I think one person showed up. And the one person that showed up was very new to this. The cyber kind of insurance was just starting. And then over the years, we've had more and more people attend. And when we started talking to them originally to say, hey, look, you guys are trying to offer insurance. You don't really have 100 years of actuary tables like you do for earthquakes and fires and things like that. So let us offer you our practical advice on how we think you should do this. And we told them how we think they should think about the types of policies and the types of characteristics to look for in a security program. And frankly, they categorically ignored us and said, we know what we're doing. And so they set off on their own path. And then they had 3, 4, maybe 5 years of way higher payout rates than what their models suggested. And so then more and more of them started attending that breakfast, and they started saying, okay, this has not worked. How do you guys suggest we do this? And we said, well, look at how real breaches are happening. Rather than asking for some sort of, checklist items of what you found in some industry best practice, do you have a firewall? Do you whatever? Start asking questions that directly tie to how breaches have happened. And so as they started doing that, they actually went from being some of the most amateur, uninformed people in the room to actually, I would argue, maybe the smartest, most capable people in the room, because it has started affecting their bottom line. They started paying out. So they put massive investments in, data science and analytics. They put PhD people on it. They put real actuarial people on it. And now their models are actually unbelievably sophisticated. I interact routinely with 3 or 4 companies that are in this space. And why do I interact with them? Because they're really interested in incorporating more and more of software supply chain analysis and how well are people doing in that space to their policy underwriting. So I think this is the next area where you will see, of course, I hope we see something from NIST, but honestly, you may see something from, Travelers 1.2 and Allstate 4.7 and, whatever, Geico 1.6. You might see that sooner than you might, and more prescriptively, and frankly, with more teeth and better guidance than you might from some of the alphabet soup of typical kind of governmental type of standards agencies.
When it starts to impact the bottom line of an organization, we tend to see a shift in the market. And you're hitting on it really well. A good friend of mine used to sell cybersecurity insurance, and they stopped when there was a massive increase in ransomware, because they had no way to go in and verify that the software or that the environment that they were insuring was actually secure enough to stand up against ransomware. So they were doing it blindly, and they realized can't do that. Now with the software guidance that you're talking about from ISO to NIST and others, the big impacts there is those are guidances, they cost a lot of money to implement.
Yep.
When the insurance company comes in and it calls up the CFO and says, hey, we're not going to provide your insurance because we can't guarantee the software package is secure or your environment is secure, anything, the CFO is going to get involved. Now the problem extends beyond the producers and the consumers. It extends into the full C-suite. Now you have more eyes on it. Then there becomes more of an investment of personnel and hopefully some money to address the problem. Because that is the unfortunate part about it. It takes money to invest into these standards, into these practices, into these procedures, because it's training, it's education, it's manpower, human power, all of that comes into play. But it's a lot less expensive than paying for the breach itself.
Well, I'm glad you brought up CFO because, I said, well, we might have seen kind of the Enron moment, in the industry. Well, directly tied to that. And I've done a kind of a piece with Daniel Miessler on this as well, where we talked about kind of the next gen CISO is very likely kind of a cyber CFO, not by actual title. But the reason I say that is because what's likely coming for them is very kind of Sarbanes-Oxley-like, new scrutiny and reporting standards, and I would say just sort of magnifying glass on what they're doing, like there was for the CFO after Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley came out. So I think what you're going to see is, when the board says, hey, this is how the breaches are happening, what kind of assurances can you give us about the software supply chain program that you're running? In the past, I would say there would have been very little direct downside to saying, look, we use some tools and we do the best that we can, but, the rest is, just going to be in our contracts or whatever. I don't think that's going to cut it, because if a board asks a CFO, hey, are our numbers balanced? And do we have only acceptable audit irregularities? And do we have no fraud? And if they say, look, I did my best, there's probably, as far as I can tell, there's some fraud and our numbers aren't exactly balanced, they're close. That's not how a CFO is allowed to operate. And I don't think that's how a CISO will be allowed to operate in the future either.
I agree with you. We are at the top of the hour, Sasha. You and I could probably talk for hours, and we typically do. But I do need to share this out. We have the quarterly product review and roadmap. If you're interested in what we do here at Reversing Labs, and you want to know what we've released over the last 3 months, as well as what's coming on both our software supply chain security and our malware analysis threat hunting side, sign up for our live webinar on January 17th. You're going to see my lovely face again, alongside Eric Thoen, our VP of Product Management. We will be going through all the goodness on the technology side. I really, really do appreciate you all sticking around with us for a full hour. That's really about it. I hope you all have a great day. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us on LinkedIn. You're on Twitter, or I guess it's X now. You can also just reply directly back to the email that we're going to send you, and we will get a response to you. Again, my name is Richard Mellick. Sasha, want to close this out?
And I'm Sasha Steele.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a fantastic day and be safe out there.